we try not to, the goal is not to copy, but to homage. It's an homage to a certain type of character.
Right.
Makes sense. We talked a little bit in the past about D20 Modern's classes, but I really want to dig deep into this question because I think it's one of the most central and interesting elements of the game and one of the larger departures from others. I think that's true of classes anytime you're building a game. It's really something that everything else hangs off of. So maybe let's start with Jeff, or actually let's start with Bill on this question and then branch out from there. So tell me a little bit about the initial genesis of the way classes were structured in D20 Modern.
So we really wanted to figure out a way to do the classes so that they would. Well, first we still needed a class system because it was D20. It was D20, right? So it needed a class system, but we wanted to be able to let you play whatever you wanted to play. So giving you, we were having a hard time finding generic types of classes that would work in modern, near future, and far future games at the same time. So my solution was the class based on your primary attribute. So we came up with the strong hero, the tough hero, the charismatic hero, etc. That gave us a building block where you could then create any kind of character you wanted for whatever setting you happen to want to attach it to. And then we did add more traditional classes as what we called advanced classes that you could opt into after fourth level, depending on how you built your character. It might take you longer than that, but fourth level was the first place you could take an advanced class and then become something that was more specific to your setting. So that was the genesis of it. That was probably one of the first things we talked about and settled on as we tried to figure out what needs to change to make this happen.
Yeah, as far as advanced classes were concerned, we didn't say you had to be fourth level. We had a certain number of requirements, if I remember right, on that. Right. But to get to those requirements, you pretty much had to be fourth level or higher. And that allowed people to both branch into their specialty classes, as well as being able to remain a strong hero and be that jack of all trades that could go in a number of different directions. The balance there was a big challenge.
Right. So it was sort of modeled on the prestige classes, which existed for D&D, but less about the prestige or the high-end stuff and more about specializing at sort of the low end of the middle tier.
And so once you had these ability score-based class bases, how did you go about deciding what kinds of advanced classes you want? What was the process for that?
Like I said, it began with what do we need in a purely modern cinematic setting. I think that was our baseline. So we had things like the soldier and the police officer. I have the book here. Let me actually look. It's been a long time. And we also wanted, the idea was we were going to add more as time went along. If everything was successful, that was the hope. And every setting, like D20 Future, would get its own set of advanced classes that were specific to that setting. D20 Apocalyptic got the same thing. So that's where we got into advanced classes, let us be more specific to the game you were playing and not generic, which is what the basic rules had to be.
Right. And the advanced classes were a really useful tool when you got into developing those settings, because it was a really good fundamental way that you could establish what was unique about the setting, what was unique about the characters in that setting.
Right. Yep. And characters, and this is important because characters are where the players first encounter the system. They're based before we get into combat, before we basically go on adventures. Basically, you're getting the feeling and the flavor of what the game is going to be primarily through the characters in your character sheet.
And it seemed to me that multiclassing was really built in as kind of a core feature or something that was assumed that people would be doing a lot of.
Yeah, we wanted you to sample and to build your character the way you wanted to. We wanted you to be able to flow in and out of whatever class structure worked for you.
Right, you can basically go like 3 levels of strong, then go into fast, then go into charismatic. So basically, you can build a character that is unique for you. And this works within cinematic universes as well, where characters may have come from have a variety of talents that are in a number of different areas. They aren't just a tough hero. They aren't just a strong hero. We would define and say, well, he's a little strong, he's a little tough, he's a little fast. Right. So and that all gave us the flexibility to model the characters we were talking about.
And is that something you did, like model famous movie characters into the system, or did you try doing this?
We certainly wanted you to be able to play things we thought you'd want to play, right? Right. We try not to, the goal is not to copy, but to homage. It's an homage to a certain type of character.
Right.
Right. Makes sense.
The professor the archaeology professor who basically goes on adventures, the cheerleader who fights demons. We basically style as opposed to a particular character or a particular actor. And
of course, in Dungeons and Dragons, a character is composed of their class, their race, sometimes a background, depending on what version you're playing. In Everyday Heroes, of course, we have professions because it's the modern world and people have jobs. And, in D&D, your job is to go kill monsters and get treasure, right? But in the modern world, a lot of us have something else we do. Some of us are game designers, some of us computer programmers, whatever it may be. So how did you work in the idea of jobs and professions into D20 Modern?
You're hitting on it really well when you're talking about, like, D&D was your race and your class. And initially in the core rule book, everybody was human, and you had your starting class, your base class. But then what could we do to differentiate the characters more? And so starting occupations were what you did before you became an adventurer.
And sometimes during, right? Like, in an apocalyptic game, right? Like being that scavenger or whatever is what you do. But in a Buffy the Vampire style game, right? Like you have a day job and then you go and do these things, right?
Yeah, I think, and there's some jobs, there are jobs that lend themselves to adventure, like you're a police officer. That might be your job during the adventure, but it also kind of might be your class, like in D20 Modern. But you could have some other things too, like if you're a spy, right? Is that a class or is that a job?
Right.
I think becomes kind of an interesting challenge in separating the two.
Right. And if you're going to play a Jack Ryan type character, it may not be you have a job as a spy, and then you have what you do as a hero is not what your job description is.
Yeah, that's true. How about with the elements that normally come with race? When you were doing D20 Modern, did you bake it in kind of all together, and then this is a game and it has its own internal balance? Or were you trying to balance against the mechanics of other D20 systems so that there's like portability for the characters between systems?
I believe that our main goal was to make it to work within the rule set we were developing. But because it is based on the D20 system, it's not hard to transport characters from one to the other. A fourth level character in D20 Modern is equivalent to a fourth level Star Wars or a fourth level D&D character. But we really weren't thinking that that's what you'd do with your stuff. If you were going to play a mixed game, you'd probably start with D20 Modern. At least that was our thought. Yeah, and we did utilize the monster manual a lot in my urban fantasy playtest games. Yes.
Yeah. And it certainly enabled crossover games. Like I ran a game at a gathering a couple of years in a row where like I took a SWAT team and sent them into the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, and you did see disparities, right? Like there are certain things that a modern group can't really deal with at all, high level magics or even mid level magics, but it nevertheless mechanically it all worked, right?
I'm sorry, I would do the same thing with Ravenloft. I've played Ravenloft as a Torg adventure, as an alternative adventure, and as a D20 Modern adventure, as well as a D&D adventure. And you've got to make adjustments. You have to give the players a chance based on the characters they're playing. And it really works. And a lot of those type of adventures like Ravenloft, like Temple of Elemental Evil, work really well to put people you don't expect into them.
Yeah, I remember when I was younger, running D&D adventures with Call of Cthulhu characters for my friends. So these poor folks from the 1920s got stuck in a dungeon of some kind.
So you're even more cruel than Call of Cthulhu. Okay.
Maybe just a little bit, yeah. Yeah, a little combat heavy for Cthulhu.
Can touch it, so at least we know where we stand.
It did.
Quote a little Jack Burton there.
So there's a number of iconic characters in the book. It follows that tradition of creating some personalities that you can follow through the examples and in the artwork. So were any of these iconic characters, player characters that you guys created?
Looking through the original ones, I think Moondog might be the only one that was a player character. I think everybody else we created to make sure we had gender balance, racial balance, and the right character for the right role.
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting point because D20 Modern was a game, I think, a little ahead of its time in some of these respects, right? Because it is a different style to reflect kind of the modern era, and it's got a diverse cast, and it definitely shows thoughtfulness in that regard, I think. Was that a goal?
We were trying. We tried. I don't know if we succeeded as best we could have, but that was certainly on our minds. We were trying to match what the real world looked like. And then to the art style, Rob Raper, our art director, we decided we really wanted to go with a comic book or type of illustrative style. And he found some great artists in that realm to bring into the fold for the book. We did that with Star Wars too. There was a set of Star Wars characters as well. So yeah, we like to do that. It helps put the story together in a way that makes connections available to the reader and the designers. Yep.
Now, 3rd edition is the earliest game that I remember that uses these kind of iconic characters as a base point. But you guys have a longer memory in the gaming world than I. So can any of you think of a game earlier than that, or was that the first one that you know of?
We had iconic characters in Torg because we also had a novel set, and those characters became our iconic characters. That's the first, and then Star Wars before that because we had Luke and Han and Leia. Those are the ones I remember and I worked on, so that's why I remember.
I can't think of anything really like the way that 3rd edition used iconics. And then, of course, as Bill said, also Star Wars and D20 Modern and the games that spun out of it, I think was pretty unique when we came there. Because, like, for example, I played the heck out of Torg before, in the years before I was at WotC. And those iconic characters were not nearly as prevalent, right? They weren't,
no, that was the beginning of it in my mind. And it grew. It grew from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I certainly remember.
They were on the cover, but that's where we really only used them. Was on the covers of the products. Yeah.
But I certainly remember doing playtest for 3rd edition and playing, Regdar or Tordek, or because we had them statted out all the way up to 20th level, so that we could play, the game at different points. And they also became, those were character sheets that we would hand out at conventions just to get people jumping into the game. So I think that 3rd edition really sort of hammered home that these were existing characters. And I think they sort of wound up feeling like they were living people because we had shared them so widely.
Pretty cool innovation just in, the overall arc of role-playing game design. I think it was an idea, that kind of grew a little gradually, but you really got cemented in 3rd edition. I think it's been really influential ever since. It's just, you see it and you go, that's a good idea. Right. And,
so that was sort of baked into the thinking in R&D when we were working on D20 Modern. It was like, I don't think anybody ever said like, well, should we do iconic characters for this? I think it was just like more like, so who are the iconic characters for this game?
We would get asked specifically about things like, why doesn't this happen? Or why doesn't that happen? And our answer was always, because if you can do it to the bad guys can do it to you.